Hello! In this video we are going to look at how we can plan for effective online teaching. The ideas here are borrowed and incorporated from Norwich Institute for Language Education, and that's why I'm delivering them in English, since this is how I was taught myself. So we're going to start with some principles for planning online teaching, and then we'll have a look at some hints and techniques that you can keep in mind when planning your lesson. After that, we'll move on to thinking about the materials and resources that we can use in online classes. And we can also look, if you're working from a course book, how you could adapt your course book to be able to teach the content you have there online. So let's start with some principles that is good to keep in mind. Firstly, you need to think what you're trying to do. Are you trying to fill a timetable for your students, or do you want them to achieve something? And I would say, of course, in many cases, it's achieving the goals that we need to do. So we identify what it is that you really need them to know. And you might even need to just look in the circumstances, look at the minimum that they need to know, and work on that. Another thing is to try to make the technology, so to say, invisible. So we should be focusing on the content, on the pedagogy, but not really on the technology, because technology is itself there and it's just working for us. I'm sure as a teacher you've got plenty of good practices that come naturally to you, and do try to keep those. Think about different skills, setting the objectives of the lessons, giving good feedback, that sort of things. And if you have some familiar structures or routines, your students might appreciate those, that you might give them some kind of feeling of security, so to say, if they are kind of in a normal sort of natural environment, even though they have gone online. And lastly, we think about assessment. How much assessment do you really need to do? For instance, if you've got limited time and limited attention from your students, maybe it's better to spend it on actually teaching your students, on getting the ideas into practice rather than doing just too much assessment. It's fine, of course, if you're going to be able to use the results later on and decide what to do next with the results of your assessment. But how much do we really need is just something you want to keep in mind. So now we'll be talking about hints and techniques. One approach that works really well is to try to incorporate more real-world activities, not just things that are written for learning the subject, so to say. So for instance, maybe if you're working on adjectives, you might want to get students to take photos or find photos on their phone that could illustrate those adjectives, or, for example, different letters of the alphabet. Or they could look around and find some objects if you were discussing the adjectives of emotions, like how they make them feel, take photos and post and share. So something which is not that divorced from reality as we have in the course book sometimes. It's also great if you can think of these activities that don't actually involve them being in front of the screen all the time. Because many parents these days are worried. We ourselves as teachers have already experienced troubles working online all day, looking at the screen. So if you can think of some activities that can actually get them moving, or just at least have a short break from the screen, that would be great. So we still want them to do some kind of exercise, because that would obviously promote not only physical but mental health as well. So look out for things like that you can use, and it's great if you can give students some kind of choice. They may feel that everything is rather their control at the moment, And if they can make some conscious choice, that is great. Like, you can give them choice if they want to do something with a video or a song. You can let them choose the content themselves. That would be great. Or you could give them a choice board, like all the means you have, and let them choose what they want and let them decide themselves. Whatever you do, it's really a good idea to keep things in small chunks, because you are very unlikely to get your students watch long videos, for example. Short ones are usually more effective, and there are lots of short exercises as well. And another thing that's really important is that we continue to differentiate where we would in a face-to-face class. So for example, let's say you're sending worksheets through Google Docs, for example. You can send different worksheets to different people or different tasks to different people. A few points now about materials and resources. Firstly, you need to think about students who might not have technology, or they might not have computers there. So think about where you could give them offline alternatives. Other things you could send them, or that they could listen to on the radio, that sort of things. And also, as I mentioned before, letting them suggest resources themselves is really useful, and getting feedback from them on what they like, what they want, or what they don't like as much probably is kind of useful. So when working online, it's great when you make use of authentic materials, like all those, again, songs, videos, articles. There's so much you can make use of, the choice is limitless these days. Before you dive into this pool of resources, I suggest creating your own. For example, you could use pre-recorded videos that you've made yourself. They could be really useful. So there's a huge amount of what's available, but you can also create your own. And again, if you look in the resources sections later on, I'll give you just a few suggestions, and we'll discuss our options later on during the webinars. As for the last point, I would save live sessions, especially if you've got few of them. I would save those for interaction with students and interaction between students. Because when it comes to just presenting new information during the lesson, and the students remain rather passive, they have no chance to communicate and to interact. And I believe that's not why we are organizing all these online interactive classes, so to say. Okay, now if we discuss our course books. If you've got it, I believe you do, it definitely makes your life easier when it comes to planning. Many course books already have a digital copy, which you might be using. It could be an electronic version of the course book. It could also be just the same book in PDF, which you can share on screen, which you can again distribute between your students, send them, or upload it on Google Drive, things like that. What I suggest you do, whether you've got a digital copy or not, before a lesson is look through a unit. First thing, decide what they could do online, and what they could do alone, which activities from the unit, for instance, they would be able to do together, to discuss in pairs or in groups. So it's very important to consider these things before the lesson, like scrutinize through your paper and make notes where possible. Think about some activities, whether the teacher is really needed there, or they could probably do it on their own. How are you going to get the answers from them? And also, how are you going to eventually give them the right answers so that they know what the right answers are? You might have to post the answers after a certain time, in chat, online, something like that. So just different options for you to consider before you actually start a lesson. Also, think about what equipment is needed, if any, and that they might not have some. So basically, what we have to do here is become really selective. Like, think about what's going to work online and get rid of something which is not that useful, if it's not going to work online, to your mind. And in general terms, just simplify. Simplify as much as you can. Like, if you think about how many times you give instructions and students don't understand what to do, and it's going to be much more difficult if you're doing that online. Some people will be afraid, or some people will be shy to ask you. So keep things as simple as possible. Break your instructions in different stages. Plan on how you're going to give them, whether you will be posting them online, how you're going to check that the students have understood what you want from them at this precise moment. So once you've looked at the work, you've decided what you can do, you've simplified, you've adapted, you have to check that you still meet the objectives of the lesson, because sometimes we can really get away from the initial point. So we have to keep in mind that there is an objective in each spreadsheet and the unit. And once you've set it, all your exercises should flow naturally, right? Because sometimes, unfortunately, it happens, we can get rid of an exercise, for say, because it's not worth being done in class. But the next exercise which we keep is actually built on the previous one. So we just have to routinely check these kind of things. And one last thing that you might want to check, that it's a good idea to give some extra work for more motivated students and perhaps some higher level students, again, differentiation. So adding extra optional work, extra something to watch or give feedback on is always a great idea.